Welcome to lesson 1.7, reading and writing equations. For this lesson, we're going to learn how to translate statements into equations. So if you recall, several lessons ago, we talked about algebraic expressions. So an expression is different than an equation. So if you remember, an expression is a statement that includes a variable. So for example, 3 plus n is an expression that represents 3 more than a number, or 7n is an expression that represents 7 times a number. And when we look at these expressions, they can't be solved, right? If I look at 7n, there's no way for me to solve or figure out what the variable n is equal to. In order to do that, we need to have an equation. So an equation, on the other hand, is something that can be solved. The difference being that an equation has an equal sign in it, where an expression does not. So for example, 7n equals 21 would be an example of an equation because we do have an equal sign. In this instance, we can now solve what n would be. 7 times a number equals 21. So I know that n in this situation would be 3 because 7 times 3 equals 21. So when we write one quantity that's equal to another quantity, we have an equation. When we only have a statement, like the two examples I just did, we have an expression. So next lesson, we're going to look at solving equation, and the focus of today's lesson is simply just to read and write equations using algebra based off of statements and word problems. So as you go through the practice section of this lesson, basically what you'll be doing is reading series of statements and developing equations based off of those statements. So I have two examples here that we're going to do together before you head off and do your practice questions. So let's look at this first one up here. Think of a number, multiply it by 3, and then add 4, and your answer is 13. So whenever we see kind of the vague a number, 3 times a number, that's typically represented by our variable because we don't know what that number is. So let's do our first example. Think of a number and multiply it by 3. So I know that 3n represents your variable or your number multiplied by 3. Add 4, and your answer, so it equals 13. So this equation here represents my statements above. Let's look at your second one. 8 added to 3 times a number is 26. So these require you to kind of think very carefully about the order in which your equation is going to happen in. I mean, it doesn't necessarily matter when we're talking about addition because 8 plus 3x or 3x plus 8 will equal the same thing, but it's more important when we're looking at subtraction because you can get different answers with subtraction. But anyways, so 8 is added to 3 times a number. So I know that my 8 is going to be added afterwards. It's added to something else. So it's added to my 3 times a number. Remember, when it's a number, that's typically our variable because we don't know what that number is. So 8 added to 3 times a number equals 26. So this equation here would represent this statement. So I'm going to leave you here with one practice question just to kind of apply what we've been talking about in terms of reading and writing equations in algebra. So the question says that Miss Smallwood bought 3 scarves. Each scarf cost the same amount of money. The total cost was $36. So what was the cost of one scarf? And I realize you can probably solve this question either by guessing or checking or doing some division. But the purpose of this lesson is to read the question and develop an algebraic equation based off of the statement or the question. So that means there needs to be a variable involved somewhere in the question. So I'm not just looking for an answer to this question. I would like of course, I do want the answer because that's what it's asking, but I want you to also come up with the equation and then solve the equation afterward, which means your equation should include a variable in there somewhere.